This is Aja Hammerly, everyone. Have you all met Aja? Auntie Aja? No? Say hello. She's going to
boys and girls.
I love this chair so much. I really wish the chair had been here the whole time so I could have used the chair and the shawl and everything. Aja actually, I think, has a pretty well-prepared talk. I'm just going to let her speak because we were a little bit light on time. We had to do sponsorship stuff. But please, a round of applause for Aja Hammerly.
So, hello, welcome to Storytime. I'm Auntie Aja, and this is not a technical talk, and this is new for me. There are no slides that you can see. My slides are black, like the inside of a black hole, Jonan, very spacey. And instead, I'm just gonna sit here and tell stories. So grab a beer, curl up, get cozy. We're gonna have story time. So why stories? Well, stories are fun. Humans use stories to pass on advice and morals and to amuse for millennia at this point. We had the bards of medieval times. Ballads are still a very common form of song. There's folk tales, there's fairy tales, and cowboy stories. I'm sure many of you had preschool and kindergarten story times where you sat around in a circle on a rug and someone read you a book and showed you the pictures. And part of this is because as humans, we're wired to remember stories and retell stories. And stories are a great way of passing on information that can cross age and cultural boundaries and is good for a variety of experience levels, because more advanced folks can say, yep, I know that story, I have one just like it, and beginners can remember, hopefully in an amusing way, the things that they can learn. So the stories in this talk are mostly fables. And by a fable, I mean an amusing story with a hopefully pithy moral. Yay, cider! Like most stories, the ones in this talk are embellished for dramatic and or comedic effect, aka they are not entirely true, or true at all in some cases. And they are not all mine. I have stolen liberally from other people in the grand tradition of storytellers. And any resemblance to companies or persons is purely coincidental. And my opinions are not necessarily the opinions of, well, myself, Seattle RB, my employer, people I've worked for in the past, any of my friends or other organizations that I may try to associate myself with at any point now, in the past, or in the future, aka CYA. So, back in the day, as the stories that I am most familiar with start, I started in manual black box testing at a big company, and I was just barely 21. And as comes with being just barely 21, I was incredibly opinionated and idealistic. Who would have thought? And I didn't understand corporate politics at all. And this was one of those companies where if you wanted to work with someone on a different team, you had to CC your manager and their manager on the emails that you were sending, because otherwise they would ignore you. Because clearly if managers were not involved, they didn't have to do it. So it was a low cooperation environment. And one day I'm, blithely manually testing along, and I realize, wait, something's wrong. Something's wrong in a bad way in production. And this wasn't urgently bad, but on a scale of 1 to 10 of badness, this was about a 6. And the worst part was, if it wasn't going to get resolved in the next 24 hours, it was going to be an 8. And I would rather not that an 8 of badness happen to the company I am working for at the time, because young and idealistic. And so I spend the better part of a day going around, sending emails, trying to find my boss, CCing people, calling people, walking around the office, trying to figure out who has the keys to production so that they can fix this issue. Because I know exactly how to fix it, but I don't have permission. I'm a lowly manual tester. And a couple hours, go to lunch, come back, and finally I figure out where the person who can fix this is. I find their office on the off-campus map. I walk down 2 flights of stairs, and I go up to the door that leads to the hallway that their office is, and I put my key card on, and the light turns red. I try it again, and the light turns red again. So my key card does not work on the door that is my one access to the person who can make things right again in the world. And I walk back up to my office, and I sit down at my desk, and I start growling, because this is something that I do at work sometimes. And my office mate, who is older, wiser, and actually likes business, he has since gone on to get an MBA, I don't know why, he's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "Something's wrong. It's bad. It's going to get worse if we don't fix it in the next 24 hours, and I've just spent 12 hours trying to fix it, and I haven't gotten anywhere because my badge doesn't work, and nobody understands, and I hate this job." And he goes, young tester, here, let me show you the way." And he slides open the top desk drawer of his desk, and inside the top desk drawer are 3 fancy chocolate bars, 2 dozen Cadbury cream eggs, and a bottle of vodka. And I'm like, I don't exactly understand what these things are going to do to solve the problem that I currently have. And he goes, no, listen, follow along. He picks up a Cadbury cream egg, leaves the office, walks down the hall to the office of this woman who has been at the company for several years, has senior in her title, and most importantly, is not a tester. And he slides the Cadbury cream egg across her desk, and whatever she's doing, she looks up, rolls her eyes, and says, "What?" We're like, our office mate's like, "Young Auntie here has a problem. I'll let her explain it." I explain the problem, and she's like, "I can help you, but it's going to require 2 Cadbury cream eggs." So my office mate goes and gets another Cadbury cream egg, comes back. While he's doing this, my coworker, who's older, wiser, and more well-connected, picks up her phone, calls someone who is orthogonal to the problem, as far as I was concerned, and says, "Hi, I have a Cadbury cream egg and a problem. How can we solve this?" And he goes, "Cadbury cream egg, you say? Let us talk." And so I explained the problem over speakerphone. He's like, "Why don't you come downstairs, meet me at the elevator lobby with the Cadbury cream egg?" So I come downstairs, he meets me, I hand him the egg, he goes up to that door that wouldn't open. Oddly enough, his badge opens it. And we walk in, he goes, "You, talk to Aja. There's something that needs to be fixed." And I explain, it's like 2 lines of 2 command line things that need to be run. We run them, all is right in the world. Crisis averted. And the moral of this story is, know people's bribes. It's very, very important to know people's bribes. So, a couple years later, I'm still at Big Co, and I'm doing automated testing, and I am still sadly young and idealistic, except for now I had joined Seattle RB, and I realized that there's actually a better way to do stuff than the way big companies do it. And so I was saying should a lot, as in we should use TDD. We should actually release more than once every 6 months. We should stress test our app. Luckily, Big Co agreed with that last one. And our release was a week away. And the stress testing team, because big company, we actually had a stress testing team, didn't have time for us. So we're like, okay, can we at least get an hour so you can explain your tool set to us? And we're smart people, we can figure it out. And so we sit down with them, we're talking to them, and 10, 15 minutes in, they're like, "Oh yeah, we don't have any clue how to test the stuff you're releasing. Our tools don't work for that." And we're like, "But you're the stress testing team." And they're like, "Yeah, you guys are doing stuff that's weird." And so we're like, okay, and then, meeting's over, and we're like, well, we've got 3 days to say that, yes, we have stress tested this, otherwise they won't let us ship. And so we're standing around the hallway brainstorming, and I'm like, well, I got an integration test, because I had moved on to automated testing at this point from black box testing. And they're like, yes, but that is not a stress test. And I'm like, well, it could be a stress test if we were surrounded with while true. So we did. And the infinite loop stress testing technique was born. And so we took a spare machine, we forked the process 10 times, and it ran in an infinite loop for the entire weekend. First person who came in on Monday hit Control-C, killed the job. We looked at the server logs. And it worked. It was horrible. Let's be really clear on this, that this is not the right way to stress test anything, but it worked. And the moral of this story is that sometimes you have to choose between being right and effective. And you have to ask yourself, would you rather be right or effective? And that was definitely not right, but it was certainly effective. So, right versus effective, though, has 2 parts. And the right part is equally valid. And it is totally and completely a valid choice. And there are times in my career that I have chosen to be right. Times that I've chosen to be right. I firmly and utterly believe that the tests you run while you're developing should not hit the internet. Because what do you do when the internet goes down? I worked at a company where the internet went away approximately once every 3 weeks. I worked at another company where the internet, the router in the router closet on our floor reset at 9 o'clock every morning for 15 minutes. like clockwork, and we didn't have a key for that closet. So you should be able to do your work without the internet. I also firmly believe in status TDD, and I have gotten into yelling, fist-pounding arguments with people at places I have worked recently about this. And I should say that I have lost every single time. But that's the joy of right versus effective. If you're going to choose to be right, make it a conscious choice, and be mentally prepared to lose, so that you can detach emotionally. There are totally times when you can choose to be right, but if you're choosing to be right, you are choosing not to be effective, very likely. If you're choosing not to be effective, you're probably going to lose. So make that decision up front. The important thing is to make the decision and to act instead of react. So, after several successful, for some definition of successful years, I moved on from Big Co, and I moved into manual test at a small startup. And we are 1 week from beta. And it's important for this story to know that we had separate client and server development teams, separate client and server test teams, and separate client and server managers. And I was working on manual testing on the server side, and I'm like, I've finished, the stuff that's been done for me. Dev's not thrown anything else over the wall yet today. I wonder how this thing all works together. So I pulled down the latest stuff from the release candidate branches, started up, 8 seconds, and Chrome goes, aw, snap, and crashes delightfully. And I'm like, well, okay. And this was actually a fairly long time ago, and Chrome was still kind of new, which makes me feel old, but we'll go with that. So I'm like, it's okay. No one's actually using Chrome. It's probably a Chrome bug. Never assume it's your tools. Never assume it's your tools. I'm like, but we're going to use Safari for the testing next week, so, I'll load up Safari. Yeah, Safari lasted 8 seconds, and then it just crashed, because unlike Chrome, each tab is in a separate process. So I go home, and I'm venting to Ryan Davis, my lovely partner, and I'm like, I hate this. My coworkers are idiots. None of this shit works. I don't know how to do this. He's like, well, did you enter a bug? And I'm like, of course I entered a bug. I entered a P17 bug, and I told my boss, and I told the leads of the teams, and they didn't do anything about it, because there's other stuff to work on, like making sure the colors are right, and making sure that the fonts are right, and making sure that everything looks good, and I'm like, and they don't understand. And Ryan's like, well, you get 1 tantrum a year. And I'm like, what? I get to throw a tantrum at work. And, I've thought about that a little bit since then, and think about the famous people in software. I'm specifically thinking the Steves, as in Steve Ballmer and Steve Jobs, and they're both kind of famous for throwing tantrums and chairs, but mostly tantrums. So, tantrums work. And I will say right now that I don't really do much of the chair throwing, red in the face, pounding tantrum, because it turns out I'm not actually very scary. It might be the pink shirts with the dinosaurs on them. I don't know. But I do have stubborn, and I can throw a stubborn better than pretty much anyone else. Turns out a stubborn is definitely a kind of tantrum. So, I'm getting excited. I can go into work tomorrow, and since they're ignoring my bug, I can throw a stubborn, and it'll be great, and stuff will get fixed. And then Ryan decides to burst my bubble by saying, oh yeah, your tantrum has to be scheduled. You get 1 tantrum a year, and it has to be scheduled. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, tell your boss that you're going to do this. And if you're going to throw a tantrum at your boss, tell your grand boss that you're going to do this. I'm like, okay. So I go in the next morning, and I pull my boss aside, and I'm like, hey, just, stand up. I'm going to be an entire pain in the ass. And he's like, well, that's not entirely unusual for you, but what's the occasion this time? And I'm like, no, really, this is going to be, I'm going to step it up a notch. And I'm like, because there's this P17 bug, and no matter how much other stuff we fix, the product falls apart after 8 seconds, so it doesn't actually matter. And so I go into stand-up with the whole team, because we were smart enough to have an integration stand-up. And I'm like, hey, that red flag's part of the whole, what are you doing? What did you do? What are you blocked on? I'm like, I'm blocked on manual testing because this thing doesn't work. And they're like, no, it's not a big deal. Integration will work itself out. It works in our, works for me. It works in our test harness. And I'm like, don't actually care. Like, end user scenario, it doesn't work. And, I'm getting stubborn, and the team's like, no, it's not a big deal. We'll fix it at the last minute. I'm like, well, what if there's a bug 10 seconds in or 15 seconds in that we won't find until we fix this bug 8 seconds in? And my boss pipes up, he's like, yeah, let's actually listen to Aja this time. And I'm like, good, because I wasn't actually going to let any of you leave until we had a plan. And so we ended up fixing the bug, and an action plan's developed, and there was a bug 15 seconds in, and there was another bug a couple minutes in. And if we hadn't fixed that bug that day, we would have been in a world of hurt when it came beta time. We would have probably pulled it off, but it would have involved late nights and some angry people. So, moral of this story is you get 1 tantrum a year at work, and it has to be scheduled. And I don't know what the rules are when you switch jobs halfway through the year, but I think it resets. So, onward. So, we've finished our beta, I'm still at the startup, and we've launched. And I've been assigned to doing ops, because I was on the test team, and clearly the test team are the people most qualified to do ops. Yeah, if you know me, this is actually hilarious. So, one night, it's about midnight, 1 a.m. something, and I'm doing a release. And Capistrano and Vlad existed at this period of time, but we weren't using them. Instead, we had a 2-page checklist that you printed out every time you needed to do a release, and you crossed off the steps you needed to skip, and you had to run through the rest of them. And this was the success case checklist. Like, if something went wrong, So, it's midnight, 1 a.m., and I'm not a night owl, and I realize I do a migration, bring the Rails site back up, and try to go log into a page, and I get, we're sorry, but something went wrong. And I'm like, and so I'm starting to freak out a little bit. And normally when I was doing this, my lead was available to me, but on this particular night, he was in Mongolia. No, really, he was actually in Mongolia. So he was not at all reachable. And I very quickly realized that what I have done is I have run the migrations from a feature branch I've been testing on against the production database. So in practical purposes, I have corrupted production. And this is not good. And so I quite purposefully start freaking out. And Ryan's on, I'm like, hey, Ryan, I don't get Rails, and I just messed up. And he responds, big alligators, little alligators, swamp. And again, I'm like, this is not actually the problem that I'm having right now. And he's like, no, listen up. And he's like, so if you're going to build a castle in a swamp, first you have to get rid of the big alligators, then you have to get rid of the little alligators, then you can drain the swamp, then you can lay the foundation for your castle and build your castle. And you have to do it in that order, because otherwise you're going to get bit. It's a prioritization parable. I get this now. So, big alligators. Make it so that the website is no longer throwing, we're sorry, but something went wrong to the public. Great, maintenance page goes back up. I know how to do that, because we actually documented it. Awesome. Restore the database. Luckily, one of the steps on those 2 pages was take a production backup before you start anything else. So I'd done that. But this is going to take about 45 minutes to restore. And I'd never restored production, but I'm like, maybe it's like restoring production to my local machine for testing. Let's hope. Turns out it was. Little alligators. I need to finish the release. I need to get the system back in some sort of running state after the backup's restored. I need to tell my coworkers what happened, because even though we had basically no traffic at midnight, the people who were going to be on the site at midnight were the type who would probably contact customer support about the fact that we had an outage, longer than the 15 minutes that we normally said that we were going to be down. And then draining the swamp, figure out why it happened and what we could do to improve the process. I got really hard on I'm going to be right about the fact that we need to automate deployments after that particular incident. I'm like, no, really. No, really. We really need to. Eventually we did. And my coworker's like, you seem to after that, you seem to be so cool and calm when we have things happen. And I'm like, no, really, big alligators, little alligator swamp. And again, they're like, alligators, what? And so I explained this to several of my coworkers, and I have at several other jobs since then. And I've been known to also say things like, when someone's pounding on my door and they're saying, we need all this stuff done, I'm like, you get 3 big alligators, pick them, but I have 5 things I want you to do. I'm like, three big alligators, those are the ones I'm gonna do. I have also said to someone, that is not an alligator, and I don't care about your problem right now, when things were particularly bad. Not a highly recommended career-furthering solution right there. So, a couple more years later, I'm still at the startup, and I have moved to dev from testing. And I am working with some folks who've been testing since before I was in middle school, or so been developing since before I was in middle school. And they had senior architect, grand pumbaa of the universe somewhere in their title. And they like to say that's impossible a lot. And I have since learned that sometimes this is a great strategy for managing your workload, but at the time I was still a little bit idealistic, and I knew that what they were saying wasn't impossible. In fact, I knew that in Ruby it was really, really easy. And so we'd be in a meeting can we automate this part of our customer sign-up workflow? And the developers would say, no, it's too hard. It'll be 145 of story points. And I would be like, or it could be 3 hours of work. They're like, no, you do not understand. And I'm like, pretty sure I do. No, you do not understand. And I lost these arguments. I lost these arguments hard and with vigor on a regular basis. And finally one got to me, and it got to me at like a really personal level. I'm like, why are they telling me I'm wrong? I know I'm right. Go back to my desk, and I'm like, I can totally prove them wrong. So I code up some really, really awful Ruby, and I attach it to the story. I'm like, no, do it like this. And it comes back and like, oh yeah, we totally did it that way. That's a great idea. And I'm like, but I was just saying that an hour ago in the meeting, and you told me it was a dumb idea and it would never work. And the moral of this story is don't argue in meetings, argue in code. Also known as the prove it strategy, and I'm going to go into a little, interpersonal judo here. If you are junior, or in some way not respected by your coworkers for whatever reason, it helps a lot to make the code bad. Make the code look like something that they have to clean up so that, they're contributing and they can save face. I hate to say this, but it is totally a valid interpersonal strategy to do that. So, if you can make bad variable names or not have your indentation quite right or something, or do it in a language that's not your production language, that's actually another really great strategy I've used. It helps. And interpersonal judo, I don't remember if it's verbal judo or interpersonal judo, there's actually a book about these types of strategies for how you can diffuse someone who needs to be right and get your way anyway, and they're really good skills to have. So, onward. This is going to be a diversion. We've talked about tender love yesterday and today, and I have the joy of knowing Aaron, and I ate lunch with him frequently for 2 years while I was working in the same neighborhood he did. And I've learned something very valuable from him, and his life is the fable here. And the moral of his life is, don't be too serious. Being silly allows you to get away with things. And the story I have behind this is I was still at the startup, and I was in dev, and I was learning how to be a better developer outside of work from all the wonderful mentors I've gotten from the Ruby community. And, oh, this is bad. My laptop just went to sleep. Anyways, what I learned from him was that you can be silly. And so I'm dealing with some coworkers who are breaking their tests left and right, and they're committing failing tests, and I'm having to deal with situations like there's 7 tests failing, and I didn't do anything. And so I eventually get fed up with this. And I tried to do it the right way, bring it up in stand-up, talk to my coworkers, and we should really have tests that pass. Otherwise, why have tests? And they don't care. So one morning I get really frustrated, and I leave My Little Pony on the desk of the worst offender. The next morning he comes in, sends an angry email to the team and says, why is there a My Little Pony on my desk? And I'm like, because you have failing tests. You're it, build a pony. And he's like, okay, and the test got fixed. So, if I had continued to argue, and some places I've worked make the people who break the tests or break the build buy donuts for everyone that they negatively affected, and those are kind of punitive and not a lot of fun, but that pony was so ridiculous that they couldn't argue. And someone made it a corral, and someone brought it some hay. And at the end of the release cycle, it got hit with a sledgehammer. But it did its purpose, and so we moved on. So, can you do whatever you did again? Okay, then Bluetooth is just not working. So I'm going to finish these without my notes, which will be fun. So one last story, because I'm running a little bit short on time. Actually, 2 last stories. First one is, success is a much bigger place than you think it is. And I've only learned this recently. And my example for this is, again, at that startup. We were dealing with some problem, and the non-NDA version of this is that we were generating Sudokus, and we needed to do this in real time. And we're like, yeah, we can totally write code that does this, and it's great. True fact, Sudoku is MP complete. Solving Sudoku is not actually easy. It is, in fact, the computational definition of hard. And we're trying to figure out why generating these problems, and you have to solve them to know if they're a valid problem, is hard, and we couldn't do it fast. And we were really getting frustrated. We spent 2 weeks trying to optimize this, and eventually we're just like, nope. Set a computer running over the weekend, we'll generate 10,000 of these things, and then we'll just pull from them in real time when we need to use them in the product. And the moral there is that there's a lot of ways to be successful for your customers. Keep your mind open and don't get stubborn like I do, and don't get stuck in your ways. And finally, one story from my last job, and I started there as a developer, and everyone was like, you're awesome, we're so happy to have you. And I'm like, I don't think I'm awesome, but okay, let's go with this. And my first task is adding authentication to a Rails site. I'm like, dude, I've been doing Rails for years, this is great. My first code review comes back, and I remember it as having more lines of comments and criticism and suggestions for improvement than actual code were in the original pull request. And I feel like a horrible person and a horrible developer. I'm like this shy of running off to the bathroom to have myself a nice good cry. And one of my coworkers who just finished eviscerating this code comes over and he's like, "Hey, you want to go get a beer?" And I'm like, but I'm like, my brain's like cognitive dissonancing really hard on this because I'm like, but I just wrote those awful code and you told me it was awful. And you want to go get a beer? And the moral of that is you are not your code. You can write awful code and still be a totally worthwhile person, and totally worthwhile people write awful code on a regular basis. So, closing. If you're going to take 2 things from this talk, first one, would you rather be right or effective? This applies well outside of code and professional stuff. I apply it to relationships on a fairly regular basis. Do I want to be right or do I want to be effective right now? I'm going to go with effective, not right. And the other one is you are not your code. And Ryan harps on this for a good reason. It really is hard to get it through your head, but if you get it through your head, you're a lot happier. And finally, since we've got a bunch of new folks in the audience, I'm going to say it gets better. You get better at picking jobs that fit with your personality, and you get better at learning the tricks that work for you. A lot of the stuff I talked about in this talk is relevant to my experience and who I am, my personality, how people see me, how they perceive me. I have to do things a certain way. There was someone I worked with who I couldn't ever enter a bug. I had to go tell him, hey, I was doing X and Y happened. Doesn't that seem strange? And then I had to walk away and go get a cookie. And I'd come back 15 minutes later. He's like, that does seem strange. You should totally enter a bug. But if I just entered the bug, it won't fix. So you learn techniques for dealing with people, and you learn which ones are worth it to you and which ones aren't, and which ones you're going to put up with. And as the better you get at that stuff, the easier it gets to be in software. And you get to spend more time doing the parts of it you like, and less time doing the parts of it where you're banging your head against a wall and you don't understand why it's not going. And I want to say thank you to a bunch of people who were my mentors over the years, specifically Ryan. About half of the pithy sayings come from him, and a good hunk of those came from a boss he had when he was relatively junior. Specifically, would you rather be right or effective is one of those. I want to thank Scott Windsor. He looked over my talk, helped me restructure it because it was kind of a hot mess early on. And he also gave me several stories from his time at Amazon. And if you want to hear more stories like this, go talk to Scott. They're good. I want to thank the folks from Ruby on Rails who invited me to come speak, accepted this talk even though it was a soft talk from me, and soft talks are kind of a wild card a lot of the time. I want to thank you all for staying. And I really want to thank my employer. I work at Google. I am in developer relations on the cloud platform, and I talk to you about nothing Google related, and they're happy with me about that, and I'm really, really glad that they're letting me still be part of my community, even though I have a job that is very technical and related to DevOpsy stuff. So if you have any questions about Google Cloud stuff at all, come talk to me. I can hook you up with a free trial. We can chat about it. I can tell you what it's good at, what we're still working on. I'm happy to answer those questions. And I'm also really happy to talk about any career advice stuff. If you have questions, hit me up on Twitter, ThagomizerRB. Also Thagomizer at Google. I got that, and I am so happy about it. If you want to email me. And I will be hanging around. I wear pink at conferences. This pink shirt has a dinosaur on it. So thank you guys very much.